NotBizzong.
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 NotBizzong. NotBizzong. NotBizzong.
NotBizzong, 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 NotBizzong.
This is NotBizzong, a Patreon exclusive podcast of the Project Entertainment Network. I am your host, Bizzong's own Mr. Frank. Hey, NotZongers, welcome to NotBizzong. In NotBizzong, we are going to take a deeper dive behind the scenes look at the podcast on the Project Entertainment Network. Now, some of you fine, long-standing Patreon contributors to the Project Entertainment Network may remember some time back, just about a year ago, I interviewed the fine folks at the Unsupervised podcast when they first joined the network. And I thought that would be a cool thing to kind of do to extend to all the podcasts on the Project Entertainment Network to try to get a peek behind the curtains of what makes those podcasts tick. Maybe you'll get more interested in a Project Entertainment Network podcast you hadn't previously been interested in, or maybe you'll get a little tidbit on what makes your favorite Project Entertainment Network podcast tick. Like this episode where I invite the good fellas over at the Mondo Method onto NotBizzong, where we can get a look at how the show has been going. The show has been on, a little over 2 years now, and they've come a long way. The Mondo Method is a writing podcast where they look at technique, they look at tips and tricks to make the whole writing experience fun for everybody who's interested in writing. And the best part about the Mondo Method is that you really don't necessarily have to be a writer to enjoy the show, because the hosts, Armand Rosamilia and Chuck Buddha, engage in such fun, friendly banter that it really makes the show accessible for everybody. So, without any more hesitation, let's give the Not Gong.
I love when he goes at the end when he's like, when somebody asks him about helping his teammates. How does that help my teammates?
You're so angry. It's great.
Welcome to NotBizzong, the official, unofficial podcast of the Project Entertainment Network's Patreon page, where I, Mr. Frank from Bizzong, interview other podcasters from the Project Entertainment Network and dig deeper into their podcasts. This is so much excitement because this time around, I'm inviting the good folks from the Mondo Method podcast onto NotBizzong. So we have with us this time around Armand Rosamilia and Chuck Buddha from the Mondo Method. Welcome, fellers.
You're a lot of excitement tonight.
I'm sorry.
I feel it. I love it. It's so good to be here, Mr. Frank.
It is. I'm glad to have you two guys on because the show. How long has it been? Are we like 2 years into this Mondo Method now?
Yeah, it's actually been It's been over 2 years now because we've not missed an episode, and we are like on probably like 4 or 5 episodes. So we're like a month past 2 years. So it's very exciting.
Now I can't I'm not going to interview you about what's the podcast about and everything. I think by now, since you're over 2 years into it, everybody knows what's going on. But I want to ask you this time around about where the podcast is now as opposed to where it started. Of course, you started out we all know this story. You've told it many times on the Mondo Method where Armand, you took Chuck aside at a Scares of Care thing. And you just pitched the idea. I want to do this thing where I mentor you through how to, the process of writing books, and we'll do it in podcast form. So now here we are, 2.5 years later. Chuck, do you still feel like you're the teacher, you're the student, and Armand's the teacher?
Oh yeah, no doubt. Yeah, there's no lack of learning. Because the business changes so often, and not even just the business side, but I just think the daily/weekly cycles of a writer, a creator, and the highs and the lows that you go through, I can only benefit from Armand's tutelage and experience because he's been doing it far longer than me, and it's a continual growth process and learning process. So it's I think the learning will continue as long as we do it. It doesn't matter how long I've been going.
Well, how about you, Armand? Do you still feel like Chuck is stupid and he needs to remain under your wing? Or do you think it's time for like new blood to reinvigorate what the Mondo method is?
I still think Chuck's stupid, but I love him anyway. But no, I mean, seriously, I think the one thing, I guess in my arrogance of doing this for so long, is I didn't understand until we really got into, like, say, 3 or 4 episodes, that I really also had a lot to learn. And I had a lot of things that I had not been doing or I had forgotten or advertising and angles and different things. I had really gotten complacent in the way I did this as a career. And Chuck really showed me a lot of really new, cool things. And, what's funny with this is each episode is about an hour, but we talk for a good half an hour to 45 minutes before we record. And then we might talk in a half an hour, 45 minutes after we record. And we're really still, we're goofing around and stuff, but we're still pitching ideas and we're talking about stuff that maybe doesn't get on the Mondo method just yet because we're working with advertising or we're doing Patreon or different things that eventually will show up. But in the beginning, Chuck was very big on taking a lot of notes as we went along, and now I find myself, as soon as we sit down to record, I always have a couple of index cards in front of me, and I'm always taking notes because he's always bringing up stuff that I'm like, oh, that's really good, or that's a great angle as well. And then Chuck is constantly, probably every day, sending me an article or something that he's seen, or maybe there's a convention, or maybe there's some kind of writing thing or a webinar or something. So we're constantly, I think, learning from each other, which is really great.
Yeah, the thing I like about it, this deep into it, there's sometimes you've gone over a topic again that you may have done, but the space has been maybe a year since you talked about that stuff. Or maybe you have a listener who poses a question about something you covered, but in a different way. There's a different sort of way to look at it. Just recently, you did a podcast on collaborations, which you had already covered, but you dug into it in some different angles than you had before. So even though, the reason I asked, is Chuck, do you need to get a new student because you've been through this with Chuck, he's learned. He's obviously learned in the 2.5 years, but like you said, even when you go back and cover a topic again, the business is ever changing, the process is ever changing, and the tools are ever changing. So it is always cool to go back and hear about what's going on now. Even though we've talked about collaboration, even though we've talked about Patreon, advertising, probably once a year, it is an honest thing to do to go back and look at what's advertising look like now, because no doubt year by year that changes.
Sometimes month by month. The Patreon, as I have another year since we last talked about it, of doing the Patreon, and I guess in my mind of where I thought I would be, and then the reality. We just did one about Create Space versus KDP, and then literally the next day after we recorded it, Create Space basically said, yeah, we're going away, which we knew was going to happen. I just didn't think it was going to be so soon. Mm-hmm. So now I'm sure in the future, one of Chuck's topics will be, hey, KDP, because there'll be a lot of changes and there'll be different things. So it's always evolving. Everything anytime listeners send us questions, even if we've covered it or maybe we've even talked about it because we ramble on and off on topics all the time, it's still a new angle that we can play with. Same with co-writing. I've co-written more books with new people since we did that original episode.
Yeah, and I think Amazon, that they made the announcement about getting rid of Create Space and going to KDP because Alexa was listening to our conversation. So that's how the timeliness of that happened. We were all over that, and Amazon wanted to get ahead of us, and so that's what happened. But to I guess further what Armand is saying is, even if we cover topics more than one time, I think our perspective changes as well. Not only the business, but our perspective on things. I was a huge proponent of pre-orders when I started the business, and quickly, through the process of shooting myself in the foot, and also just because of the restrictions on pre-orders, I quickly became an adversary of the pre-order process. And I think around this point, 2.5 years after the fact, I'm starting to come around to pre-orders again. So kind of like what Armand said, I don't think that you can really beat up a topic too much just because of the different points in time that people come into the show and join us and listen and maybe not go through the back catalog, but also because our opinions and our knowledge changes over time. So I think each time, while it may be some pieces of it may be old to somebody who's a longtime listener like you, other parts may be fresh and new based on what we're going through currently.
And that's cool that you brought that up, because it's something I want to bring up with you guys is that, you know, those new listeners jumping on board may not go back, because I was really blown away this year at Scares That Care, the second year since you started Mondo Method, and the amount of people coming up, especially since I tabled with you, Chuck, the amount of people coming up and just saying, you know, I love listening to the Mondo Method and a big fan, I always listen. I mean, that was huge this year, just compared to last year even. You know, there were a couple people saying it. But this year, there was a huge presence and a huge fan base, I guess is the best word to say, for the Mondo Method this year. So in 2 years, you've really grown a very strong base of writers who are really interested in your guys' take on things.
Well, it's very humbling. I know I almost wanted to cry a few times at the table because I felt so just good. You know, my heart was swelling and stuff, because it's like, oh my God, like I actually may have an impact on people, and it's just tremendous to be able to give back, because a lot of times I feel that all I do is take from Armand and all the other great, you know, gracious people, Brian Keenan, everybody who have helped me along the way. And to have other people come up and say that they're getting something from the show is extremely gratifying. And it's also helpful, because a lot of times, you know, Mr. Frank, you sit on here on the microphone and you talk and you go, I really don't know if I'm getting through to anybody, you know. And then when somebody comes up and says they point out a specific show, or they engage you in a conversation about a topic, it's what we love to do. Every time the three of us get together with Timmy and stuff, all we do is talk shop. You know, we talk about writing and creating and publishing and all the nuances. So it's just exciting, and I'm just so glad that people are getting as much out of the show as I think Armand and I are.
Armand?
I think for me it's fun because, like Chuck said, you know, talking shop. You know, we're all married, and our wives, while our wives are supportive, our wives could give two shits about the whole writing process and all the other stuff. They don't understand that they're not writers. And I think sometimes that gets lost. So it's always, for me, it's always really good every week or every other week when we record to be able to just talk shop, you know. I interview other authors on Armcast podcast, but that's a different thing. It's a lot of people that maybe I haven't talked to before, and it's a lot of authors that might be a lot more advanced than I am, you know, in their careers as opposed to mine. So I try to learn something from them, but I think after 2 years of doing this podcast and knowing Chuck longer, we're really kind of on the same page. I think, unless I'm mistaken, Chuck, when you come up with a topic, you already kind of have an idea of where I might be, you know, where my answer might lie.
Sometimes you still surprise me though, and I kind of like that aspect too. You know, how you force the whole let's go into this without knowing what's going on type of thing, and almost have just a discussion, a conversation without really, you know, digging in and doing all kinds of research. I mean, we do some research and fact checking, but for the most part, we come at the show really as a conversation and go back and forth. And because of that, I think it leads to I think something that's more accessible to people, to listeners, because it's not like we're preaching down to somebody. There is a give and a take, and there's learning on both sides, and there's giving on both sides. So it's a lot of fun.
You know, one of the things I do like about the show is that you're like, neither one of you are the utmost expert on this stuff, and you freely admit that when you're, you know, giving out your advice on the show. Yet, you know, you're still, people like still come to you and listen for the advice and listen to hear where you guys are on things. Well, you know, not being like a Brian Keene or even like a Patterson or a Stephen King or somebody who really has sort of authority over all these topics. Has anybody ever like called you out on your advice? Like, no, that's completely wrong. I can't believe you told everybody that.
Not to my face.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't think so, because I think me and Chuck are very open and honest, and we were open and honest from the very first episode. We don't know everything. I love to reiterate that I did everything wrong in this business, and I still do a lot of things wrong. And that's how I learn. I learn the hard way. And anytime we get into any topic, you know, we're quick to say this is my opinion or this is Chuck's opinion, and we don't always have the same opinion when it comes to a lot of things too, which I think is great. And that's the fun of this business. There's no be all end all that, hey, let's all just make, you know, Stephen King money because we do it this certain way.
Yeah, and I think there's other shows that I listen to. I listen to probably about 20 different writing/creative podcasts, and I think all of them bring something unique to the table, and I try to get something out of all of them. But the ones that sort of turn me off are the ones that where the folks come across as they are the know-it-alls and the experts, and while they will also say, hey, we've tried lots of things and made lots of mistakes, but this is the way you should do it. I always take that with a grain of salt, because I have tried a lot of the things that some of these other shows have said, and some of them have worked a little bit and some of them haven't worked at all. And I think that's the case with all of us, because we've all had different types of experience with either the advertising or getting reviews, etc. So there is no one size fits all. So I think the fact that we're open and honest from the front and say, hey, this is our experience, and then we always end the episodes by saying, please give us your feedback. Tell us if you know how to do this, let us know, or give us your experiences on it. So we very much want it to be a community and not a teacher-student type thing where we're just preaching.
Yeah, I really think those things are what helps the Mondo method really stand out amongst all those writing advice podcasts, because I've listened to a bunch of them too. And I'll be honest with you, I think the Mondo method is the only one that has any real personality to it. All the other ones are they're sort of stiff. They're sort of very just calm and NPR sounding, and this is the way things are, and just and then you guys come on, and like you said, like it may be an hour, but you may spend even the first 20 minutes talking about what you just had for lunch, what rock band you're listening on the radio, and it's real loosey goosey, and it sort of sets everything up. And it also, the other thing you guys do as a writing advice podcast that other ones don't do, I think, is you have people who are not writers listening to you and enjoying the hell out of you. That's where that personality, you know, you own it, and you get an even broader spectrum of listeners, it seems like, by, you know, what I'm seeing from your listenership coming up to you at Scares and stuff. So, I mean, was that sort of a conscious decision for you guys to just, you know, leave that banter in about the, you know, what I'm having for breakfast and where I went to eat and that type of stuff?
I think it's just natural. It's just me and Chuck. You know, when we first connect, I start recording, and at first, you know, probably the first dozen or so episodes, I would cut all of that banter out, and we would start the show. And then it got to the point where I was slipping a few of those things in, and that became funny, and people really liked that back and forth. And I think as Chuck's gotten a lot more comfortable being on the podcast, and I've had a lot more fun doing it. I think a lot of that comes out. I mean, most of those things, yeah, it's great that people might remember some advice we gave or something, but a lot of people remember me screaming at my wife, yelling, professional. I mean, Jim Herbert made a meme out of it and a little video and everything. I mean, that stuff is hysterical. So, that's and lately too, I'm just recording, and then all of a sudden, me and Chuck are in the middle of a conversation, and I just start the show, and it throws him, and it's funny. I mean, we just did an episode where we literally talked about Southern rock for like 20 minutes, and then all of a sudden, we just jumped into the show, and I'm like, I'm leaving all of that in because it's funny, and people like that. Bill from Unsupervised Podcast, also here on Project Entertainment Network. He listens. He's not a writer, but he's creative, and he listens to us, and he takes that advice and he uses it for that. And he also has a lot of fun just listening to me and Chuck busting each other's balls and going back and forth too. And I think that's kind of important. It wasn't a conscious thing we did. I think it's just our personalities just really mesh well.
Yeah, it definitely evolved because I don't think we've really had a conscious discussion about anything from a business standpoint about the podcast and, our vision. I mean, you had a vision at first when we started, and that's really the only discussion we had. It's just kind of evolved over time. And I think we have our most fun talking shop and everything when we feel like we're just sitting around having beers talking. So I think the Mondo Method podcast has become almost an extension of our writer retreats with Mr. Frank and Timmy and our Beers and Fears tours and stuff, where we stand around and we have a good time enjoying each other as friends, but also talking shop and just, being ourselves.
That's actually the lifeblood of the podcast right there. Is it's almost like standing and hanging out at a Beers and Fears tour. At least that's my opinion, of course, and it seems to be a lot of other people's opinions as well. So that's all the time we have for this episode. I want to thank Armand and Chuck for inviting us into their world, kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit on the Mondo Method podcast, which I was a little worried about because you guys are you put it all on Front Street. There's not much to hide beyond the curtain, like Armand said. He's recording the second the phone call connects. So I hope somebody learned something a little more out of this. But if there's nothing else to learn, it's tell us when we can listen to the Mondo Method on the Project Entertainment Network each week.
You can find us every Wednesday, usually every Wednesday morning. It depends on when I actually put the thing together and get up and all that stuff. But usually I try to get it up right before your morning commute on a Wednesday. We usually go about an hour or so you can easily listen to it on your ride to work or at the gym or I don't know, any other weird things that people do.
So there it is. Thanks, guys, for joining us on this episode of NotBizzong, and listen to the Mondo Method every week on the Project Entertainment Network.